You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and now it's time for the Paranormal Peep Show.
Hello, welcome to the July edition of the Paranormal Peep Show, where you join myself, Neil Ward, and also Andy Chaplin. So, Andy, how are you again?
Yeah, pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm fine. I've been busy on the psychic development front, actually, because I was telling you about how I've been doing these demos at the Weymouth Spiritualist Centre, and things are kind of getting interesting there, because I remember us discussing recently how this medium recently brought back someone's horse, and she said the horse was marching up and down the aisle, which I thought was a bit bizarre and strange, and we kind of had a laugh over that. But interestingly enough, I was doing this reading. I seem for some reason be picking up a lot of information about these two ladies that were friends sitting at the front, and I got some really bizarre things. I was picking up. I picked up the name Rufus, which was her nephew, and I started going to this background about how someone had a really major issue at a lake, and it turned out that one of their family nearly drowned, and I kind of picked up on that. And then I started getting things where I could see these hands and fingers in my mind's eye, and I knew there was something medically wrong with these hands, but I wasn't sure what. Something medical was wrong with them. So I said, does someone in your family have some problem with their fingers? Either yourself or someone in your family. I said, I can see something wrong with your fingers. I don't know what it is, but there's some issue there with the fingers. And she said, yes, my father and my brother, and they're both deceased, and they were the ones that were coming through to me, I think. They both had this genetic problem in their family where they were both born with, instead of thumbs, they were born with like big toes on their hands, which was really strange. Now, I obviously didn't see big toes in my mind's eye, but I just got the feeling there was something wrong with the fingers in the family, and I didn't know what. And then she confirmed that, yeah, they were both born with big toes. So it went from the father down to the son, these big toes born on your hand. And she said, fortunately for her, she wasn't born with this big toe issue. And obviously it wasn't visible to me there, but I picked up on it. But then the next thing I got, suddenly, as I was talking about that, I suddenly got this thought, someone here has got a pet snail or had a pet snail. And it sounds really crazy. Oh, come on. Why am I picking that up? And the lady next to her was her friend said, yeah, I could confirm that I had a large African snail, and they're the huge ones. They eat bananas whole, and these huge record-breaking African snails. I remember seeing it on Record Breakers many years ago as a kid. And, but she confirmed. And then I suddenly got the age of it. I said, did it die when it was 9 years old? Because that's what popped into my head. And she said, yeah, she said it died maybe about 8.5 years old. So I was kind of close to that. And I thought, how bizarre, Now, I wasn't suggesting that the snail was coming back saying, hello, everybody, here I am. I just picked up on the fact that she had got a pet snail in the past. I'm not one of those sorts that's going to bring animals back and they're going to say, hello, remember me? Because I think that's just, daft maybe. Maybe I'm being a bit closed-minded on that, but sometimes I have to draw a line somewhere.
They project feelings. It's not. You don't really get human kind of language being spoken. That you get feeling from.
Yeah, that's right. You get. I got an emotional connection with most of the stuff I was picking up. So, but yeah, I didn't get any kind of feelings from a snail. But it was just a very interesting thing to get. So, but yeah, this lady was taking everything down to the weirdest stuff. And sometimes it's the weirdest stuff, like having a pet snail can be the best evidence, because like not everyone has had a pet African snail in their life, and so, yeah, and she had it for 9 years. So it's certainly a major part of her life, I would say, rather than having a pet snail, you put in a matchbox for a day and it disappears or something. So, yeah, cool. So what about your stuff? How is your tuned in events going?
Yeah, very busy at the moment. So we've got tons going on. If anyone wants to have a look and see what we're doing, go onto Facebook, tuned in events, tuned with a D in events. We've got a lot of things coming up all over, really. Hertfordshire, Essex, North London, Bedfordshire, all over.
Cool. Okay. Well, stay tuned for that, everyone, on Tuned In Events. And if you want to have a psychic reading and see some demos happening and see Andy at work with his friends, pop along to one of the events around the Hertfordshire area.
We're also, before we move on, we're kind of constantly developing what we do and how we do it. So it started off being kind of psychic one-to-one readings, and then we bolted on demos with that kind of like me, as you're talking about, kind of working with an audience type demos. We're now also bolting on ghost stories. So as well as one-to-ones and mediumship with a group, some of our readers actually do ghost walks and ghost events and paranormal investigations, things like that. So some of them are going to be retailing ghost stories of various things, not only the pub but the area, and sort of things going in the vicinity of the paranormal nature. That's quite
cool. Excellent. I love good ghost stories. Always helpful to help you get to sleep at night. Right, I think it's time to bring in our guest then. Someone that I've been looking forward to chatting to. We haven't chatted to him for quite a while. In fact, the last time we chatted to our guest was just as the COVID-19 pandemic was becoming big time stuff. And so we had a chat with him on the Apollo Detectives, which is another show that Andy and I partake with Ben Emlyn Jones and Marcus and the crew, if you're familiar with that show. So I'd like to welcome back to us on the Paranormal Peep show for a change. Randy Walsh from Canada. Hello, Randy. Are you there?
Yes. How are you, Neil? Andy?
Hi, Randy. How you doing?
Not too bad. And yes, it's been about 4 years. Good to see both of you again. Seems like just yesterday.
Yeah. Time flies. Well, you've been very, very busy, haven't you? Because you've been, the first time we spoke to you, you just brought out your first book.
Yeah.
Which was based upon your research of the Apollo missions. Yeah. And then not long after that, you brought out a second book. So I think, we will go into other areas, but I think we'd like to start off with the Apollo missions. But obviously, you've got a history because you're a pilot. And so this is an unusual thing for an Apollo hoax researcher, because that's obviously what we're going to be discussing. Normally, most pilots would say, of course, the Apollo missions were real. I'm a pilot. I know what I'm talking about. You know nothing, But it's kind of a turn on that, really. So I'd like to go back to your history, though, because obviously you were a space fan as a kid. You born in Ireland, ended up in Canada in the late 60s, just as the Apollo missions are really picking up the pace. What was your memory back then of the Apollo missions, and how did you then view them?
Yeah, very interesting. Actually emigrated with my family to Canada from Dublin, Ireland. Back in 1967, I believe it was December 1967. So it was a good 2 years before the actual supposed first landing on the moon. But of course, during that period, the Apollo missions were ramping up, and they were promoting it, and we were hearing about it in the school and so forth. And so, long story short, 2 years later, here I am, a little 9-year-old in grade 9. Grade 5 or something. I don't know. It was like 3 or 4, something like that. But anyway, what I remember, and it's very interesting, it's very fascinating, actually. So we were all in school, brought down to the auditorium. So it was like a gymnasium turned into an auditorium. And there was about 500 or 600 kids there. And there was this little black and white TV in the corner. And I'm, from a distance, not realizing what was going on, but it's a big moment, and you don't fully understand it as a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I was for the launch of Apollo 11. So that was my first sort of, exposure to a real event like Apollo 11. And how can it not make an impact on a 9-year-old? How can it not? And of course, from there, I became everything about Apollo. I became such a space enthusiast for the next, I would say, probably about 15, 20 years. I believed in the whole narrative. I bought into it. I used to buy back then, of course, for a lot of people who, this new generation, they used to sell these little paper models of the Apollo spacecraft. And of course, I was always wearing them out and getting new ones. And, so it was everything Apollo for about 15, 20 years. So, I mean, my transition from believing in the official narrative to where I am now is a marked difference. There is quite a contrast. And I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure many people have had the same experience. So yeah, so that's how I sort of got introduced to the Apollo missions, the heroes.
And you got an interest in aviation. Sorry, Andy.
I was going to say, at what point did you start getting a little bit suspicious? I think Neil was probably asking something before we get into that.
Yeah, well, actually, no, that's a good question. And what I can do is lead up to that. So in my 20s, I always, of course, having a love of the space industry, what's the next best thing that I could do that's practical and was never going to be an astronaut? Well, it's fly airplanes. And I've always had a love of airplanes, even before actually the Apollo missions. So when I was old enough, had enough money, I went and did some flight training, liked it. And from there, it just took off, pardon the pun, it just took off. And and so I got my private license. And I think it was about another 10 years, accumulating experience and then upgrading to my commercial pilot's license. And then from there, I added some more endorsements like, twin engine endorsement. And I needed to get an instrument rating because an instrument rating is really imperative if you're going to go into this commercially. So by this time, I was in my late 30s, and something very interesting happened one night. I come home from work, switched on the TV as I usually do, and I was just walking back and forth. And I wasn't really paying much attention to what it was saying, but it happened to be a documentary on the Apollo missions. And I remember it got my attention when they were talking about the gravity assist or the slingshot around the moon. And I knew enough about the Apollo missions at that point that they were talking about Apollo 13. And what they were talking about was the explosion in the oxygen tank, which led to an almost disaster. And they couldn't use engine power. They couldn't use the service module engine power. So they had to use gravity assist to get themselves back to Earth. And so I was listening to this, and this really caught my ear. And I now know it was Commander Jim Lovell. And he was talking about how they had to fire the lunar module engine when it came around the dark side of the moon, and to fire the engine to put them on track, back to Earth. But what he said here was very interesting. When he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says, I was talking to so-and-so, and I said, when I fire the engine, no matter what you do, keep the Earth within the grid pattern on the window. And he was talking about, I don't know if he was talking about the lunar module window. I think he was actually talking about the optics in the lunar module because of the configuration of the spacecraft, officially speaking, at that time. The lunar module window would have been facing down, so he wouldn't have seen the Earth. So he's probably talking about the optics that they would use to navigate when they were landing on the lunar surface. So I found that really interesting. And I was thinking, wait a minute, you're 240,000 miles from Earth, and you're using manual and visual cues to get yourself back on course. I knew right then that there was a problem with the narrative, because when you're that far away, if you have any kind of flying experience, it doesn't matter if you're a private pilot or you fly a 747, any kind of flying experience, you know something about navigation, and you know how easy it is to go off course. And if you're, let's say, a degree off course just on a natural, on a cross-country trip here from, let's say, where I am here, in a small city to another small city, well, you're going to be off track if you don't correct. Now, use that analogy and think about navigating 240,000 miles away from the Earth with the Earth in a grid pattern, and all you need to be is a fraction of a degree off course, and you could be thousands of miles off your track, and you would never get back in. Effectively, you'd be in an elliptical orbit forever because they didn't have the propellant to get themselves back on course. So that right there told me there was a problem. There was a problem with the official narrative. You would have thought that they were using sophisticated computer navigation equipment. No, not really. They like to tell you that, but that's not exactly how it really worked out. So that was my first red flag. So that kind of stuck with me for years.
That would be pre-Pong, wouldn't it? Pre-Pong technology.
What was that?
That would be pre-Pong technology. You know, the tennis game that came out.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
The ones you plugged into the back of the TV. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. So it kind of went from there, and it wasn't for about another, I would say, 10 years when I started to really look into it and start taking it seriously. And that, of course, led to my research, which then led to my first book.
So I mean, obviously, for those that are not familiar with the Apollo missions, Apollo 11 was allegedly the first one that landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And then there was Apollo 12, followed 4 months later, I believe, still in 69. I think it was like November 69, something like that. And that's where they couldn't get the cameras to work because apparently one of the astronauts pointed the camera when it said, "Do not point at the sun." He pointed it at the sun. And so they didn't really kind of have a mission that they could televise to the audiences, which may have been in the planning because their move sets maybe weren't kind of ready if it was a fake thing. And then I think it was 1970 was Apollo 13, as you said, with Commander Jim Lovell. And they had launched out there and just somewhere, I think they were stirring the tanks or something was the expression I've heard. Certainly those familiar with the Apollo 13 film are probably much more on cue than I am about that. But they had to stir up the tanks with the propellants or something like that. And that's where the explosion apparently occurred in the command module, which caused them to have a problem, which meant that they couldn't actually land on the moon. Now, one of the things I found interesting, and it's what you alluded to there, was the navigation coming back. Now, they were still docked with the lunar module was still docked all during the whole mission virtually with the command module. And that's how they fly from Earth all the way out to the moon. And it's only at the point when they're in orbit around the moon and they're going to have a lunar touchdown does the command module and the lunar module separate and the lunar module goes down and lands on the moon. Now, obviously, in this case, they didn't do that. They had to abort a moon landing mission. So, as you said, they tried this slingshot thing. And Jim Lovell's saying, right, look out the window through your sextant or whatever that device may be that they're trying to navigate their way back. And I was thinking about this while thinking, hang on a minute. This navigational sextant device is designed for use on the lunar module only, perhaps when they're taking off from the moon and they're navigating their way back up to the command module or something. But if you've got the docked command module in front of the lunar module anyway, wouldn't that, with the size of it, block the view of any navigational devices anyway, which they weren't designed to do? So I'm trying to think, how on earth could they navigate their way through, looking, like, say, through that top window, which is on the ceiling from their point of view, because that's looking at the front capsule end of the command module. I mean, that's what struck me. I mean, I don't know what people's thoughts are on that, but just from that point alone, it wasn't designed to do that job anyway. And somehow, miraculously, they were using it, according to what it says on the script.
Yeah. They actually had a sextant on the command module as well. Yeah. And they weren't using that. They were using the one on... Now, according to the official narrative, the sextant on the lunar module was supposed to be used to make sure that they had landed in the right location when they landed on the surface of the moon. And that was supposed to confirm that they were where they're supposed to be, type of thing, right? But the narrative keeps changing, Neil, and you and I can go back and forth on this till the cows come home. But the narrative keeps changing. NASA keeps changing its own narrative. First, it was the keeping the Earth within a grid pattern on the lunar module window, which was depicted in the movie, Ron Howard's movie Apollo 13. And then later on, if I'm not mistaken, the physicist David Baker came out with a book and he said, no, they were using the sextant in the lunar module to navigate back to Earth. Now, for people that understand navigation, people who don't understand navigation. Either way, it's a very precarious way to navigate because, first of all, yes, you do have to navigate by the stars. Ships were doing it successfully for hundreds of thousands, for thousands of years, using a primitive form of the sextant to navigate by the stars, and it was very effective, more or less. But we're talking about precision navigation here, which is necessary. So the computer would be programmed with a set of star patterns, multiple star patterns. It would still have to navigate. The ship would still have to navigate from the moon to the Earth. But in the case of the Apollo, it was done with human input. In other words, the astronauts would be looking at the stars through the sextant, and then they would be taking the coordinates and feeding that into the computer. And that's the problem that I had with that. That might work in low Earth orbit, and even then, that's very iffy. But to actually navigate manually from the moon to the Earth at a distance of an average of 200. And by the way, I just want to let one point out here. When they were talking about firing the engine, I think they were officially speaking, and I'm speaking just within the official narrative. They were supposedly halfway back to the Earth at that time. So I think they were something like 150,000 miles out. But still, navigating with that method, manual method, 150,000 miles out, yeah, no, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. That's a red flag right there. And there's many red flags. As I got into my research, many more red flags come up, but that was really the first one. So again, just to answer your question, there's really no firm answer to this, given that this narrative changes all the time. I mean, I've seen it. Other researchers have seen it. I know that Scott Henderson has seen it a lot in his research. He's actually seen how they've updated their research when it comes to the film and photographic record anyway, to try to counter what people like us are saying. So I've come to just not take the official narrative seriously. I'm just trying to use a little common sense now in this. And common sense is telling me you cannot navigate 150,000 miles in space to Earth with with a manual assist. You can't do it. You might have some success on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but you can't do it in space 150,000 miles away. You need a computer to have all that information and star patterns and juxtaposition of the spacecraft to the Earth and the moon and the sun and the stars to have that accuracy that you need to get back in.
Does he say one tiny little increment out and you're up in the state?
Yeah, no, sorry. I'm sorry. I had a little trouble hearing your audio there.
Your mic, I don't know if your mic needs adjusting, Andy. It's a little bit low, unless you're not switched on. Maybe it's your settings. Maybe you're on a different mic or something. Sounds a bit noisy anyway, but...
Put the headphones on there, Andy, and I can might be able to better hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I can hear you, but it's very noisy. That's better. That's better.
Oh, I know. It was just because we logged out and then logged back in the beginning.
That's a little better.
And since Microsoft, here's technology for you, just a little offside. Because technology is so fantastic, it doesn't recognize the microphone that I previously chose. So I now have to choose it again.
Of course.
There's technology for you. Brilliant. But apparently you went to the moon using...
And they say AI is going to work, right?
Oh, no.
Yeah. But I've got a clever trick up my sleeve, because what happens with every show now, I run our audio through a very clever thing called a podcast studio or something like that on Adobe. It's free to use. For any podcasters out there, you upload your audio and 10 minutes later it processes. As long as it's under an hour, so I have to edit it in chunks. And so we should iron out that problem anyway, using the podcast studio audio enhancer. So it's a very little clever device there. But getting back to the Apollo technology, one of the things that kind of intrigues me about this navigating back manually with a computer, with Apollo astronauts coming back to the Earth, is that they're looking through their scope or sextant or whatever, and they see the Earth and they're saying, okay, aim for that, and thrusters on full pelt type of thing, and there they go. Now, the thing is that the Earth and the Moon are constantly in motion anyway. Yeah. And so when you're aiming it at that point, you're heading in that direction, but the Earth is going to be moving slightly off, over a period of hours or something. So, like you say, the degrees are going to get greater because you're aiming there, but it's a moving target. So, unless you're kind of aiming to the left of the Earth so that you catch up with the Earth as it moves round on its orbit or something, I don't quite know how that would be done, really.
Well, that's a very excellent point. And just to talk about that for a second, you need, when you launch a space vehicle of any kind, you need a reference point, because the computer has to reference that point in order to determine where you are at any specific time in space. So the reference point, common sense would say the reference point would be the launch point, right? So now you've got the launch point and you've got the Earth's rotation. And you've also got the Earth moving. And then, of course, as you say, you've got the moon on its path as well, and it's moving. So the computer would be constantly having to update all that data, and it's a lot of data. So they'd have to be taken into account exactly what you just said, Neil, in terms of the moon's orbit around the Earth, because it is moving when the spacecraft is en route and coming back, and when it's supposedly on the moon. So it has to account for all of that, and the juxtaposition of our planet, the moon, the sun, and the reference point, which I mentioned earlier, and the stars. That has to be all taken in and processed. That has to be updated. I'm going to pick a figure here just out of the air, but every second that would have to be updated. But that's not how the official version says it, that they would be told by Houston, okay, it's time to do a check. So they would check the stars and see where they are and go, oh, everything's okay, right? When the more you read about the official version, I'm just talking purely about the navigational aspect of it. It's a clown show. I mean, that's what it is, right? I don't think Monty Python could write a better skit. And that's the bottom line when it comes to their form of navigation. So, and we're talking between Earth and the moon, millions of square miles. You're off by a fraction of a degree. You're screwed.
Yeah. Well, go on, Andy. Do you want to say
Randy,
something?
have you come across a guy called Mike Barra? He's been on a few TV shows on Sky, but he's an American guy.
Mike Barra, that rings a bell. Give me his background.
So his the kind of shows he's been on is mostly kind of UFO stuff, but he's also been on was the moon a hoax landing? Was it was it hoaxed? And he was, if you like, the guy that would question it. Oh, maybe it is a hoax kind of thing. But his actual view is that we did actually go, and he kind of like wrote a book on it. But
yes, I think I know what you're talking about. I think I read his book.
Yeah. I actually invited him because I put something up. First of all, kind of, I added him as a friend on Facebook. It took a while, and he actually, responded and added me as a friend on Facebook. I then put up something about the moon being the moon landings being a hoax, and he made some comment about, oh, I wrote a book about this in support of the moon landings. We did actually go, and everything else is a crazy conspiracy theory. So what I did, I actually said that we've got a thing called the Apollo Detectives. Do you want to come on and talk about it? And he never responded. I never got a response from him. But I was just going to ask whether, first of all, I want to put a shout out if anyone knows Mike Barra, or if he does listen. He probably wouldn't, but if he does come across this, do come on the Apollo Detectives with us, because we do need more people who support the moon landing so we can talk about the technical data. But how this relates to you, Randy, I was going to ask, have you come across him? Have you debated with him, argued with him, and have you got into the technical aspects of it? Because he claims to have the technical aspects sorted in terms of why we did go.
Yeah, no, I haven't had the pleasure of going back and forth with him. Now, that brings up another issue, is a lot of, I give Blue Earth thing credit for this. He came on, of course, he's a pro Apollo. He's pro Apollo. When he came on, we disagree with him, but what I did appreciate about him coming on was that he was civilized. Yeah. And he wasn't in any way out to, he acted a little childish in certain segments, but overall I thought he was pretty good in presenting his case. And even though he did have help online, which is okay. I mean, he took on 5 of us, so I mean, I'll let him have that.
Yeah.
But at least he was civilized. When you have proponents, most proponents will not come on and debate. Now, Steve Mumbling came on and debate because Steve Mumbling doesn't use evidence to back up his point. He's a bully. That's what he does. He uses abuse. And I mean, I applaud all of you for staying the course with him. I mean, I don't know how all of you did it, but he didn't present any evidence whatsoever to back up his point. He kept insulting people. He went after Scott Henderson, kept insulting him, and it got to the point where a lot of people, like my friends and family, when we were watching this, a lot of them just couldn't watch it. They just thought he was too negative. And that was sending out, that sends out a vibe, and it sends out a very negative vibe. And I really think that that's what he was doing. Now, I don't know, maybe he was doing it subconsciously, but most of the proponents that I have talked to back and forth online tend to descend into the abuse because they don't have, and it's not necessarily, you don't have to have technical knowledge. I'm not an expert. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a mathematician. I don't pretend to be an expert on the technical part of it. But I mean, my flying and being a pilot gives me a bit of a step up to it. Where I sort of knew what I was getting myself into. But anybody can research this information. You don't have to have a mathematics degree or a physics degree, and that's what they always fall back on. You're not a rocket scientist. You're not a physicist. Yeah, but I'm not an idiot either. Okay. And, everybody has the ability to use their own common sense, their own discernment, and can research this for themselves. But constant theme with these proponents is to intimidate you and to elicit an emotional response, which is what Steve Mumbling was trying to do. He was actually trying to elicit an emotional response from all of you, and all of you pretty well stood your ground. So again, applause to that. And that's basically their MO. That's what they do. So I've asked a few people to come online on my video, my own channel, and have a chat, and all of them have said no. Steve Mumbling asked me on his channel, and I said no. I said, first of all, I don't know who you are, right? And of course, after seeing him in what he's like, it's just, there's no way I'm going to debate an abusive bully like that. You're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to win. All right. He's going to talk louder. He's going to talk over you. So there's no point. So I'd have to say, Andy, I'd have to see Mike Barra in action and others in action online, see what they're like, see what their disposition is before I would agree to debate them. Because I'm telling you, it's just too much negative energy. If it's too much negative energy, it's just not worth it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But again, like I fall back on Blue Earth thing and say, well, we debated him, and that actually went very well. I thought that whole interview went well. So if he's listening, I'll give him credit for that.
Yeah, because this is it. I mean, the thing is, I want to believe that man stepped on the moon. It's not like I don't want us to. I want us to believe it. It's just that, is there the evidence to support it? And the more we're looking at it, the more it seems like it's a giant hoax.
Well, it's a very interesting point, because I want to believe it too. I wanted to believe it for even when I found out, when I had determined for myself that these missions were faked, I still want to believe it, and I don't. And then people say, well, you just don't like anyone who is superior to you. Well, you know what? That is a very childish thing to say. Neil and I have gone back and forth on some music, and I love guitar. I love guitar. I love all kinds of guitar. I love classical guitar. And one of my greats is the amazing Julian Bream. I think he's the #1 classical guitarist in the world. I idolize him. Even though I play guitar, I'll never play like him, but he inspires me to do something that I've always wanted to do and to enjoy. So to say that I don't appreciate anybody who I think is superior than me, oh, come on, I mean, that is a childish thing to say. I value the contribution that Andres Segovia, Julian Bream have made to classical music and classical guitar. They're an example for us. They show us our capabilities. The Apollo mission started off that way. We all believed in it. They were our heroes. I idolized them when I was younger, when I was a teenager, even into my 20s and 30s. Not anymore. They're not heroes. They were a deception. They were a deception, part of a bigger deception that actually, I'll get into some other areas here for a second. I just divert for a second. The last 3 years was a really big example of that deception, and how the Apollo moon hoax is part of that deception. It's all part and parcel to it all of it in history, from going back to 1913, the Federal Reserve Bank, up to the World War I's, World War II, the JFK assassination, the Apollo moon hoax, 9/11, you name it. It is all part of the same fabric. And that's what people have to start realizing. They have to start connecting the dots. And you can only do that from a 40,000-foot level. It's all right to get into the details, specifically as it applies to one specific conspiracy fact. But you need to elevate yourself to the 40,000-foot level to look at the bigger picture and see what's going on. And you see it's all connected and it's all related.
It's like going off in a slightly different direction, but it's like David Icke says, he regards himself as a dot connector. It's not hundreds of different conspiracy theories. It's a one big line deception that we live in.
Exactly. And David Icke and that's his genius, is that he's able to look at things from a 40,000-foot level, and he connects the dots, and he himself won't tell you he's an expert. He never says he's an expert. He's never once said he's an expert. But he uses what we all have, and we're not using it. And people like David Icke and others out there, other truthers who get slammed, and we'll get slammed for actually mentioning his name, bring it on, I don't mind. Yeah. Right? But he points out, and you may not agree with everything he's saying, with David Icke saying, some of the stuff gets maybe a little out there in left field, but I would say most of what he's saying are matters that people should be listening to and looking into it for themselves. If you're going to disagree with somebody, that's fine. Disagree with them. But how about doing a little bit of research yourself? All right? Develop your own point of view. Read both sides. I always say that, and especially when it comes to the Apollo missions, read both sides. Read the official narrative, and then read the conspiracy narrative, and then come to your own conclusions. What is wrong with saying that? And I'm being slammed for saying that. I see nothing wrong with that approach.
You've also, as well as reading the other side and reading the conspiracy ideas behind the moon landing, you've also delved deeper than a lot of people, which you mentioned in your books, where you studied the F1 engines, which are on the Saturn V rocket, and their performance. And you talked about the speed of them and how much could they get up into orbit within a time frame and things. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because obviously you made I've never seen anyone else talk about the F1 engines, apart from there was one guy, I think it was in What Happened on the Moon documentary, and it was a guy who was a rocket kind of engineer. I forget his name now. He's actually passed away, but he talked about, look at the flame coming out the Saturn V and you'll see it's running rich on fuel or something like that. It's not quite the color it should be. It was a lot cooler flame than if it was meant to be at full power. It should be almost like a white hot flame, and this was more of an orange flame. But he said they added more fuel to the mixture to make it look more impressive or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about your research into the Saturn V?
Yeah. So the Saturn V really relied on the first stage and the all-powerful F1 engines. So to put that into perspective, the average rocket engine, I think the most powerful engine they had up until the 60s, 70s, even now, each engine would produce a thrust of 200,000 pounds. I'm in American measurement here, so forgive me out there, people. So it's 200,000 pounds. So the F1 engine, one F1 engine was designed to produce 1.5 million pounds. That's 1.5 million pounds. So what they needed to do was that they needed that enormous amount of thrust, which is what, like 10 times the average engine, right? So they needed to develop the F1 engine because they needed that amount of power and thrust to lift the Apollo hardware into low Earth orbit. That's just into low Earth orbit, not to boost it to the moon. The F1 engines didn't have that purpose. The purpose is to get the Saturn V up to an altitude of 40 miles, jettison the F1 engines, and then from there fire the J2 engines to get it up into parking orbit. And then from there, the rest is history, right? Now, the F1 engines was it still is classified as the most powerful liquid fuel engine ever built. Now, that was actually being worked on in the late 1950s, the U.S. military. And then when Eisenhower had signed into order the existence of NASA, they transferred the F1 engines over to NASA, but not NASA as not NASA per se, but Rocketdyne, but was oversaw by NASA. So the corporation Rocketdyne was building the F1 engines. And this comes into play now with Bill Kaysing. And Bill Kaysing has taken a severe beating over the last several decades, but a lot of people miss Bill Kaysing's point. Bill Kaysing was hired by Rocketdyne to oversee the latest developments at that time. So he was obviously qualified to read the data, or they wouldn't have hired him in the first place. So I don't understand why people are always ridiculing him, telling him he was a paper pusher when he was actually there to analyze the data. That was his function. And he, of course, oversaw, was reading the data output for the F1 engines at the time it was in development in 1959. And he had noticed that they were able to get a maximum of 1 million pounds of thrust out of one F1 engine for a millisecond. That was it. It broke down after that. Yeah. And that's the only recorded data that can be relied upon. And I'll get into that point in a minute. Just bring me back to that point in a second. So he continued on and had noticed in subsequent years, 1960, 1961, 1962, because now the F1 engines were adopted for use in the Apollo program, right? So he noticed that he was seeing suspicious data output from the F1 engines. He was seeing it initially, and then he was seeing it change later on. And he realized that the data for the F1 engines was being falsified to fit the narrative, because he was there. He actually resigned in 1963 in disgust, but he had realized that they were falsifying the data to fit the future narrative of the Apollo missions, because at that time, the F1 engines were officially part of the Apollo missions, 1961, 62, and 63, right? And remember, Kennedy had announced the Apollo program in 1961, landing a man on the moon and bringing it back before this decade is out. So he resigned out of disgust. So this gets into the individual you were just mentioning, Andy, earlier. I read a paper by a Russian scientist. I put that in my book, and he noticed with the launch of Apollo, I think it was Apollo 6. Yeah. So there was 2 unmanned launches of the Saturn V. The first one was Apollo 4. The second one was Apollo 6. Now, before I get to that, so you have each engine, you have 5 engines in the Saturn V, first stage. 5 engines. So each engine has 1.5 million pounds of thrust for a total of 7.5 million pounds. Okay, that's a lot of power. Compare that to the average rocket, maybe 1 million pounds for all engines combined. Here, you have 7.5 million pounds of thrust for all engines combined. And they needed that enormous amount of power to get the hardware, the 46-ton hardware, into low Earth orbit, as I just mentioned earlier. So the question is, when we were watching the launch of the unmanned launch of the Saturn V, and with Apollo 4 and Apollo 6, the 2 unmanned launches, were we actually seeing the F1 engines at work? Or were we seeing something different? I have a theory on that, and it's just a theory. I can't prove it right now. But I believe they did attempt to use the F1 engines in the first launch of Apollo 4, the first unmanned launch of the Saturn V. I don't think they were using full power, and it seemed to be a success. Then, with the launch of Apollo 6, Apollo 5 was not was Saturn 1B launch. I'll get to that in a minute. With Apollo 6, they launched, and I think they tried to use full power. They were trying to get that 7.5 million pounds of thrust out of the engine, and that's when they had a lot of problems. That was a near disaster. That particular mission was a near disaster. And Andy, that's I think what you were talking about when what was happening is the flame was expanding beyond what it should have done. And it was also changing color. And then you had also flame coming out the sides of the Saturn V as was launching. And he was able to determine, Russian scientist was able to determine by looking at it that it was kerosene that was burning, because they were using kerosene mixed with liquid oxygen for the F1 engines, right? They were using liquid hydrogen in the other engines, but they were using specifically kerosene for that. And he was able to tell that the kerosene was not burning properly. And he knows he's a scientist. He knows kerosene. He knows kerosene when he sees it. And that's what he saw with Apollo 6. So there was a major, and I remember watching a documentary on that mission, Apollo 6, and an engineer was talking about that. And he said they had had astronauts on board the Saturn V, unmanned launch of a Saturn V with Apollo 6. They would have had to abort. That's how bad it was. They would have had to abort that mission. The astronauts would have had to abort. So if I can just go a little further, specifically what was happening is that the problems that they were happening with the F1 engines was this. So it had to do with the cooling system. So you have this enormous F1 engine. So you have the, you have the engine parts up here, and then you have the fuel injector, and then you have the combustion chamber, and then you have the throat area and a nozzle at the bottom. Okay? So let's focus on the combustion chamber of the F1 engines. The temperatures were ranging 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit in that combustion chamber, and it needed to be stabilized. So what they did is they ran hundreds of cooling tubes on the outside of the combustion chamber, and they were pumping 30%, 70% of the propellant through the outside of the combustion chamber, those little tubes that are on the outside, to absorb the thermal energy, to try to stabilize, because if you couldn't stabilize the temperature, you'll have a distortion of the combustion chamber and you'll have an explosion, and you would lose the mission, right? It was those tubes on the outside, these hundreds of little tubes, that were breaking down. And because they were breaking down, the combustion chamber was becoming unstable due to increased heat, which was causing it to basically misfire. So what was happening is, misfire is a layman term I'm using here for all you technical people out there. All right, don't come at me. Misfire. They didn't have the clutch right. Yeah, But what they were doing, so what was happening is because that rocket was no longer in sync with the other 4 rockets, you had what is called a pogo effect. And it was the pogo effect on a longitudinal axis of the rocket that was causing a huge vibration. And that was leading to the loss of the rocket. That's why these engineers said that if there had been a crew on board, they would have had to abort. Now, long story short, this is getting technical, so I'm going to kind of keep it short. So long story short, it was only 7 months later when they supposedly rectified the problems with the F1 engines that they were having, because NASA had to admit it had a problem with the rocket. They wouldn't specifically say the F1 engines, but they did admit there was a problem with the launch of Apollo 6. And then from 7 months later, they went to not only launching another Saturn V, but this time they put a crew on board without any further testing in between Apollo 6 and Apollo 8.
That's crazy.
Apollo 8 was the first one that supposedly orbited the moon and back.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how is it that you're going to risk the lives of 3 astronauts? I don't care if they're test pilots. You don't risk the life. You don't blatantly risk people's lives like that, even if they're test pilots, U.S. military test pilots. You don't blatantly risk people's lives, because if you do and the program fails, you'll get nobody else to come forward, right? So how is it they went from Apollo 6 to Apollo 8 in seven months without any further testing, with all the renovations they had done to the F1 engines and the Saturn V rocket itself, without any further testing? No ground testing, no actual testing in the air. They just went straight from that near disaster to putting a crew on board 7 months later. Does anyone believe that?
Sounds a bit of a miracle to me.
It kind of reminds me of the Challenger disaster, doesn't it? I think one of the tiles fell off, and that was during launch, wasn't it?
The Challenger was the O-rings.
Was it?
On the SRBs, the solid rocket boosters, the 2 large rocket boosters strapped to the side of the tank. Oh, here we go. This is
so this is a book.
Rocket.
Yeah. So this is a book by Eugene Reichel. He works for the. He's affiliated in some way with the European Space Program, and he's a pro Apollo opponent. So he believes the whole official narrative. All right. He's an engineer. He wrote this. He wrote a series of books there for anybody who's interested in the whole official narrative and the details. And it can get a bit dry, but the details, these are the books to go with. He's got a series of books out. So let me read you one paragraph he wrote about the F1 engines. And tell me if you think there's a problem with this. So he wrote this. He said, the spontaneous combustion instabilities, which I was talking about with the F1 engines, the spontaneous combustion instabilities never reappeared after they supposedly fixed them. Until the end, however, the problem was never completely understood. So here we are in a situation where they fixed the problem but never knew what it was they were fixing and never reappeared again. Monty Python.
Yeah.
To this day, it remains a constant problem in large rocket engines for which an individual empirical solution has to be found. To the disappointment of the engineers, a model was never found with which they could generally overcome the problem. Now, Your Honor, I rest my case. I mean, seriously speaking, he spells it out right there. They had a problem. They didn't know what the problem was, but they managed to fix a problem. It never occurred again, and all the missions after that, up to the launch of with the launch of Skylab, all the Saturn V launches were perfect. No questions. Let's all go home. Case closed.
So maybe an Apollo enthusiast will come back then and say, well, okay, there was an issue with the engines, but then they would say, well, how do you explain the photography in low Earth orbit of say, the lunar module in Earth orbit where they were testing it out, or the command module in Earth orbit testing it out? They would say they've obviously got that hardware up there somehow. What would your reply to that be?
Yeah, so I'm not saying that manned missions to low Earth orbit are impossible. I'm not saying that. So I'll, for now, give them the benefit of the doubt that they're capable of at least going to low Earth orbit. Although, when you look at the program, it seems precarious to this day with technology they've been using for 5 decades. That's another subject for another day. It's easy. That's an easy answer if you look at the fact that the U.S. military had and still has the largest film studios in the world, even far larger than NASA. And if you look back on their history, the U.S. military, who were made all their propaganda films in their studio, which are bigger than Hollywood studios and more sophisticated in terms of their technology. They have propaganda films they were making in the 40s and 50s are still classified to this very day. You can watch them, but they're classified in terms of how they were made. Why? Well, obviously, because they had far greater technology. The military always is about 20, 30 years ahead of what we know today, right? So it's quite easy. I have no doubt that the military was capable of some of the photos and film that we see presented as the official version presented to us by the U.S. military. Remember, the U.S. military was heavily involved in the Apollo missions, right?
I forgot what your stance on this, Randy. What's your stance on Stanley Kubrick's involvement, if any?
Yeah, Marcus Allen has done a lot of good work on that, and I've heard him talking about. I sort of agree with the narrative that I don't think he was directly involved, but I do think that he might have been involved in some capacity as a consultant, but I believe it was a special effects man that he used a lot on the set of his own movies that may have been directly involved in filming or at least filming some aspects of the Apollo missions. But you know what? Again, just to fall back on what I said earlier, if the military has technology that we don't know about, they had technology back then, photographic technology, film technology, wouldn't they have comparable special effects experts of their own?
Yeah. Could they, for instance, here's a sneaky one, could they kind of, if you were kind of like military NASA type people, have a meeting with special effects Hollywood people, not tell them what it's about, and just say, hey, could you do this? Could you do that? and they go ahead and do it. The military take it away and then do their own version or improve upon it and just don't tell them what it's about. So they might not, I think the word is compartmentalization. So you only know your tiny little bit. You don't know what's going on further up the ladder.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can reverse that. What if Hollywood went to the U.S. military for information on how to make better films?
Yeah.
It reminds me of a little story that I was only told a few years ago, back again, just before the pandemic happened. I was reacquainted with someone that I used to work with in the 1980s who was celebrating her 70th birthday. And so she, through kind of mutual relatives, basically sort of got back in touch with me and said, I understand you're doing videos and things like that. Could you film my 70th birthday party? And I said, yeah, sure. That'd be great. Nice to see you again kind of thing, all these years later. Now, how her and I knew each other, we worked at an army film unit, if you like. It was called back then in the late 70s, early 80s. And then in 1982, it merged with a television unit of the British forces to become... And basically, they were tasked with making all the films for the Army and Air Force. And I think they did do some stuff for the Navy, but mostly the Army and Air Force training films. And so later on, I started in there as a kind of a storeman stroke film librarian, where I'd have to put these films into the library and I'd have to take these films into a repair room. These films would come in through the post from a great big Royal Mail van. And these films would get booked in, manually with an old ballpoint pen on a clipboard, before the computers came along. And my job at that time was to take them into the repair room where this lady, who was the supervisor, would check them through, and make sure there's no tears in the film or the sprockets were strong, along with a team of other ladies. And they would do all that all day, checking the films. Now, when I got back in touch with her only recently, about three years ago or something, we were talking about the old days and things like that. And she said that now this was before I even began there. I started there in 1981. So I would have put this about 1978, 79, 1980, around that period of time. She said, did you know that the Russian general came knocking on our door back in 1979 or whenever it was? I said, no, what was that about? And she goes, well, they accused us, or they accused the British of stealing a military Russian film from them. And I presume this was somewhere in London, because obviously you got the Russian embassy in London, and the Russians had found one of their training films or military secret films had gone missing, and they were thinking the British have stolen it somehow. And so they'd sent a Russian general and a couple of Russian security people, maybe soldiers, I don't know exactly what, out from London to the home counties of Buckinghamshire, where this place was. And I won't give her whole name. The lady that I knew kind of was the first to meet them, and she goes, "What do you want?" And they said, "We have come for our film. You have stolen it.
The video. We want it back."
And she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And she honestly had no clue what was going on. So she passed it on to her supervisor, who's now deceased. And they ended up marrying each other. So this is how he got the story back to her. He told her the full story when they both retired, and it was all quiet down. He said, "Do you know what happened that day?" And she goes, "No." And she says, "Well, the Russians were accusing the British intelligence of stealing one of their training films or something, and they were denying all knowledge. But what happened is that the British intelligence or someone had got the film out of London and taken it to this place in Buckinghamshire, secreted it away, and they locked it in their safety vault or something." And so they were just denying it completely to the Russians. "No, we haven't got your film. We haven't got a film. Go away, go away." And in the end, they had to leave empty-handed. But he said later on, he said, yeah, we did have the film. We did steal it. And we kept it in our vaults, and we had to get it out of London because, it was too hot a potato to keep up there. So they took it out into the home counties to this, army training place that I worked at. And I presume they must have made copies because in those days you had film projectors and things like that. But you also had a very clever machine called a telecine, and it's how they showed films on the TV. And you'd put these 16mm films on like a projector, but it'd have like a video scanning kind of camera, and it would copy it over to video. So I presume that, this film was labeled top security secret or something, and they must have made copies of it onto video or something, I reckon.
What was on the training film?
I have no clue.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, no clue what was it about. I don't know. But it's interesting. I remember putting some of these films back into the library, and I was always curious about what some of these films were. And one of the films I remember seeing was To Mars and Beyond, it was titled, To Mars and Beyond. Now, I never saw it because I didn't know how to thread these things up anyway. And I didn't really have access to that kind of machinery at that time. But yeah, it's called To Mars and Beyond. Now, interestingly, no film passed through my hands as a film librarian back then that said anything about the moon. Nothing about the moon missions, nothing about NASA, nothing at all. And yet here was a film called To Mars and Beyond. And I thought, that's an interesting film. I'd love to see that sometime,
That sounds like I could use the analogy of a Freudian slip. Like, why all of a sudden are they talking about Mars, and why are they talking about Mars and beyond? Is there technology that we're not aware of?
Yeah,
exactly.
This is what I was talking about last night, Neil, with the secret space program. Do you remember me saying there's a fourth camp? Just to kind of fill you in, Randy, we were briefly touching upon kind of like the moon landings and things when me and Neil were talking. And there's different camps of people. There's the first camp of people that believe absolutely the official narrative that we did go to the moon. Then there's people that believe that we went to the moon and the NASA astronauts saw UFOs and kind of moon structures on the moon. Then there's the camp that don't believe that we went to the moon, but there are possibly structures on the moon. Then there's the camp that we have been to the moon, but not during the Apollo programs, and there's a secret space program. So there's all these different camps with different kind of conspiracy hats, if you want to call it that, of varying degrees, and it's just interesting, I felt.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And they also put out that, they're the ones that actually put out the misinformation and disinformation, not us. They're the ones, they accuse us of putting that out, but it's actually them that are doing it.
I know.
And they want to muddy the waters, and then they purposely create these groups and these divisions between people. And this person, as you just said, this group has their belief, that group has their belief. How many times have you been accused of, they bring up the flat earth theory. And they always bring that up with me. They accuse me of promoting the flat earth theory. And hey, I've only ever talked about the Apollo missions. Oh, I'm getting into some other stuff now with some books I have coming out, different stuff. But I've never talked about the flat earth theory, yet they keep accusing me of promoting the flat earth theory. And it's just more a
misdirection.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a tactic they use to try to discredit. Every time I put a video out now, and I'm sure you and Neil and Andy have had the same problem. Every time I put a video out now, there's a disclaimer on my video. That's why I've got a backup channel now, with BitChute and Rumble, because I try to be careful on YouTube, but you've really got to be careful what subjects you're talking about, because you can lose your channel, right? So now my recent discussion with Marcus Allen and Robin Landry, who I'm writing a book with at this moment, actually, we got into the JFK assassination, and as soon as I posted the video, immediately a disclaimer came up from Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, it's incredible. One of the individuals going back and forth with me on my video right now, my latest video, he's talking about, he's always been censored and this and this. Well, you don't have any problem with censoring us.
Yeah.
So why are you complaining about censorship when it's your side that's constantly censoring everybody? Just look at the last 3 years. You lot were censoring anybody who dared to speak out against the official narrative.
Yeah.
Who dared to speak out against the, the whole medical thing, the intervention, if I could put it that way. Exactly. Anybody who dared to ask a question was, you're a conspiracy theorist. That's disinformation. No, it's not. And science is not. Science is about asking questions.
Exactly.
It's always about asking questions. Science is a consensus. It's not a fact. And if you look back, any period throughout history, science has always been it's fluid. It's constantly changing. And for somebody to say that is wrong, this is right, no, it's not. And the last 3 years was the biggest and the best example of how we've been misled, right? So, and the good part, though, is that all of this is now out in the open. And the narrative, more people are discussing it than ever before in history. So there's some good things that came out of the last 3 years, if I can say that, with sensitivity, because a lot of people got hurt. But the narrative is now out in the open. So in a strange kind of way, it might have been a necessary evil to wake people up, to get people to see more of what's going on, to get them talking about it. And now that's where we are. So I am seeing some encouragement, but we're going to go through a lot.
Haven't they also recently cancelled any manned mission to Mars? I think I saw that in the news. Am I right with that?
They haven't planned it. Well, I mean, they've talked about it.
I thought something. Let me. You guys have a talk. I'll see if I can find.
Yeah, my understanding of any Mars mission is that they're always pushing this Mars narrative about, eventually in the next 10 years or 12 years, 13, 15, whatever years, we'll be landing a man on Mars. And, I even go to the shops and see kids' toys now about Mars missions, assemble kind of Palatoy space kits and things, all about going to Mars. Like in the 60s, it was always the moon, but now it's Mars. But now, of course, they're trying to get back to the moon with the Artemis missions. And
Okay, here we are. Space News independent report. Sorry, Neil. Independent report concludes 2033 human Mars mission is not feasible. I'll just drop that in chat.
What a thought.
Let's have a wee read of that. So anyone that wants to have a look at this, spacenews.com independent report concludes 2013 human Mars mission is not feasible. That's actually from April the 18th, 2019. They've also, the European Space Agency has also cancelled anything to do with Mars probes working with Russia to Mars as well. So we've got that. That's a slightly more recent one. European Space Agency, this is 2022, cancelled the way forward to Mars. So we got that one as well. So it's looking like they're kind of saying, we'll go to Mars. Oh, no, we're not going to Mars. Oh, we'll go to Mars. Oh, we won't go to Mars. So there's a lot of this going on.
Yeah. And I think part of that, too, is to divert attention away from the moon mission, because Artemis won't be going anywhere near the moon. No man will be going anywhere near the moon. And even though they have the ability to fake it better than they did 50 years ago, a lot of people are now fully aware. A lot more people are aware of their capabilities. So they would really have a difficult time fake. Let me put it to you this way. If they want to fake another mission to the moon, they're going to have to land right by Apollo 11, and they're going to have to put the camera on what's left of the remnants of Apollo 11 and show us the deterioration over the last 50 years. How are they going to duplicate that?
Yeah.
They can't. They don't, because they're guessing. They don't know. So there's a lot that they have to sell. And they're not going to be able to sell it. So we'll get to the starting line, and then we'll be pulled back, right? And I mean, it's just amazing. And just when it comes to the Artemis mission, I haven't studied it much, but my understanding is that it's using the same technology the space shuttle used. It's the technology that's going back decades, and they're still having problems with it.
Yeah.
What gives here, right?
Mm.
And with that kind of, if you had that in aviation, you wouldn't be flying from country to country. If you had that kind of instability in its technology. And it is instability, right? So again, I think they're trying to get us away from the moon thing. I haven't seen a lot of hype over it since the so-called success of its Starship launch.
It's interesting because last summer, I was working for a news broadcaster in London, an Iranian/Afghanistan news thing. And you're thinking, what were they doing broadcasting from London? But it's because they're broadcasting outside of the regimes of Afghanistan and outside the regimes of Iran. So they can, and they're kind of being financed by Saudi royal family or something like that. So I was led to believe. But they was obviously talking about, the broadcasting, they were covering it on their programs. Or, I mean, I couldn't understand the Farsi language, but you could definitely see the Artemis stuff there. And one of the guys that was a journalist, I ended up chatting to him in the tea room about it, and he said, "Oh, my daughter's so excited! I'm going to be interviewing one of the astronauts that's going to go to the moon." And obviously, I thought, "Oh, this must be the Artemis thing." I said, "Oh, why? How come then?" He said, "Well, because this astronaut, although she's American, she's of Iranian descent." And so that was of interest to this Iranian channel. You see, they thought, oh, that'd be a nice little kind of angle to take, that they can focus on this moon mission because she's an Iranian astronaut. And this journalist was saying, yeah, she's flying to the moon next month. And this was August, and it was like September the next month, and when it was scheduled to fly. And I said, no. I'm pretty sure. They're not going to be flying people to the moon next month. I understand, that they're going to be taking off and just testing this rocket out, and that's all they're going to be doing. There won't be astronauts. I said, I think there's going to be some test dummies on there and things. And he really didn't realize this. So, so I said, well, do you want me to kind of brief you on what I know? And he goes, oh, yes, please. So, we had a little chat, and I took him right back to the Apollo missions. And I said, because he said, I don't know what questions to ask this astronaut. What do you think I should ask? So I said, well, okay. So I gave him my angle of the whole Apollo mission, saying, there's a lot of people that say that they can't get up to the moon because of the Van Allen radiation belts. And I gave him a kind of basic science thing of the Van Allen radiation belts, where they're trapped radiation particles around the Earth's magnetic field and that kind of stuff. And I said, and even when you get to the moon, you still got all that gamma and cosmic radiation hitting the moon all the time. So I said, it'd be great if they could get to the moon, but maybe one of the questions you might like to ask this astronaut is how they're going to cope with the radiation. And I gave him like a list of 10 questions to ask. And anyway, he had to then go and see his editor-in-chief to run these questions past him before he could then ask the astronaut in question. And I saw him maybe the next day. And I said, oh, how'd you get on? He goes, oh, I'm so angry. I said, why is that? He says, well, all the questions that we devised, I've put to my editor, and he's changed them all, and he scribbled it out. And the one about the radiation, he's just struck off. And he goes, no, ask them about UFOs and aliens instead. Cliche stuff,
I think that's a kind of like a brief insight of what's going on a global scale. When people have got pertinent questions, and this includes the ouchie fouchie in almost any kind of given subject, if you try and go up the stages, and you'll hear this thing from skeptics, oh well, if that was true, you'd hear it on all the news channels. Well, the reason you don't hear it on all the news channels is precisely what you were talking about, Neil. It goes up to editorial level. Oh, I would just scrabble that out and ask about UFOs.
Yeah. I thought it was a real good opportunity to get real good questions out through this guy, and it thwarted the editorial level. Now, whether the editor-in-chief, knew anything about radiation, it perhaps wasn't of interest to him. He didn't perhaps really understand it. And I just thinking, oh, let's like ask about aliens or something, which is interesting, because like talking about the Iranians anyway, talking about their belief in their religion, I wonder how they actually view the whole alien and UFO stuff anyway, because, it's a bit of a, according to what I was told, the Iranian year is something like 700. So, we're in the year 2023, but their Iranian year is something like 700 or something, So they're kind of like in the Middle Ages from their point of view, their terminology of when they went back to their Muhammad kind of birth, I guess, 700 years ago. Whereas we take it from the birth of Jesus. But of course, our planet is a lot older than that anyway. But it makes me just wonder about how they term the whole thing of like the whole idea of aliens and things in this modern world now, with those kind of really old beliefs and medieval beliefs, if you like, of Muhammad and winged horses. I suppose the story goes that he had a winged horse and ascended to heaven on a winged horse, which is an interesting piece of mythology in itself, I think. And you could sort of think of that any way you want, I guess.
Maybe we should put a shout out if there's anyone from an Islamic country or a Muslim background, then drop in the comments what the Quran says about UFOs and aliens, and what the general Islamic belief is in UFOs and aliens. I'll tell you what, I quite like the Italian mindset. I was watching something of all things on Sky last night about Benito Mussolini and how he kind of met his end. and it goes into the kind of like the Italian mindset and what they think. Generally speaking, Italians in Italy distrust everything they hear from politicians. Everything. They have a very healthy distrust of authority, and they assume as the default position that everything that's told by a politician is lies, which I love. I love that.
I like that.
We need that. We need that a bit.
We need that in North America. Boy, do we need that in Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was you going to say, Randy, just before we got into Mussolini?
Yeah, no, when you were talking there, one would think that a journalist would have at least some broad knowledge of some of the more controversial subjects. I mean, if you're in that profession, you don't have to be, you're not an expert in one specific area, but you would have a general knowledge. And for him to be absolute dumbfounded on what you were talking about is frankly surprising, especially in this day and age. Right.
Yeah. I mean, considering the fact that he thought that they're going to be launching this Iranian background astronaut to the moon that September, literally, 3 or 4 weeks after we were having this discussion, he thought they were going back to the moon. So it shows he wasn't really clued up about it at all. He was the wrong guy for the job, I think, really.
And it sounds like even if they had the right guy for the job, he was going to be nixed anyway by the editor.
Yeah.
There's a command here, and I see that so much. Where I mean, that's really what it's all about, isn't it? Journalism is not journalism; it's actually censorship. That's what it should really is what it is. They're not real journalists, in my opinion. For all of these out there that want to defend the journalist, I'm just saying it in my opinion, they're not journalists.
Did you hear of the Simon Parkes incident with the reptilian cartoon image on This Morning? This was before the whole Philip Schofield scandal. Did you hear about that, Neil?
No,
you've alluded to that once before.
Yeah. So Simon Parkes, I quite like him. A lot of people don't like him. He's controversial, but take it as you get it. But he's very into aliens and UFOs, political stuff, New World Order, and I find his talks fairly interesting. But he was invited onto This Morning, which is kind of like a show. I don't know what the equivalent would be in America, but like a just morning talk show, basically.
Good Morning America type of thing.
Yeah, something like that. And he was asked to talk about his experiences, and he actually had some little cartoon drawings, illustrations of what these beings were that he looked that he had interactions with and what they looked like. And he was asked, can we have them by the production team in order so they could show them on camera? And they showed the greys and they showed the praying mantis, but for some reason they wouldn't show the reptilian ones, and they didn't put them on camera. And then off camera, he asked them something along the lines of, "Oh, why didn't you put the reptilian ones? Because those are quite interesting." And he was just told by the production team, "Oh no, we're not allowed to. We were told from above we're not allowed to."
Oh, interesting.
Isn't that interesting? If they don't exist and it's all crazy conspiracy theory.
Yeah, and that might explain such the almost violent response to people who bring it up. The reptilian agenda, especially with David Icke, he brings it up a lot. He's written about it many times, but you see symbols of that everywhere you go.
Oh, of course.
And this is the thing. I mean, you go down and visit Dealey Plaza, the JFK assassination site. You see it all over the place. And it's very symbolic. There's a lot of symbology down in that area where he was killed, which I'll be writing about in a future book, but just for now, it's just as a matter of interest. But, people seem to get, they're afraid of anything that gets into that area or the occult or anything like that. And yet it's out there, it's in your face. In fact, the global elites who run the world for now, that might change, but who are running the world, they live their lives and they plan their events based on a cult.
Yeah.
And there's no denying it. They do it. And when people say, "Oh, I don't want to hear about that," well, you're cheating yourself out of some very valuable information that could actually protect you.
Yeah.
Right? Because they love to tell you what they're going to do before they do it. What happened the last 3 years was predicted in a novel back in 1980. They said there would be, are you familiar with that? They were, I forget the name, but he predicted, now, I don't believe it would actually happen, but he was setting the narrative 40 years ago that that's what the official narrative will be in the year 2020, and it'll be a respiratory virus.
Wow.
Right? And he wrote that in a novel that will happen in the year 2020. Well, that brings me to another point. I don't know if the two of you are familiar with a famous variety show here that used to exist 50 years ago in the United States, and it was called Laugh-In.
Oh,
And
Ronan,
yeah,
something's laughing. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Roman and Martin, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they used to do a skit every night. They do a news item. And this one particular news item, with this show aired in 1969. And this is 1969. And they had, the skit was 20 years ago today, President Reagan will preside over the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Wow.
Yeah, wow was right. 20 years before it happened, they predicted it.
Berlin, 20 years from now, 1989. There was dancing in the streets today as East Germany finally tore down the Berlin Wall.
That's pretty eerie.
That is eerie.
No, how is it they picked Reagan and not anyone else?
Yeah.
Because at that time he was just like a B movie actor, wasn't he? Like cowboy films. And
I think he was governor of California, but he was at best a B movie actor. But he didn't become president until 1981. Yet in 1969, they flippantly make a prediction.
Yeah.
It's they like to tell us what's going to happen before it happens.
On a slightly different note, what do you think's going to happen with the Trump situation?
Yeah, you'll be watching that one very closely. Obviously, we're looking at a witch hunt, to say the least. I think I wouldn't be at all surprised. Look, when we go back and look at the last 3 to 4 years, especially over the Trump's presidency, one thing that Trump did that a lot of people are now starting to appreciate, even those who hated him back then, is that he either on purpose or inadvertently brought about the narrative. He brought this narrative out into the open, right? So a lot of things that we would never talk about out in the open, we're now talking about. And I think that the messages from Q in the last several years, I think that's probably, if you look at the messages of Q, like say if you go back and pick a date in 2019, and he would say in 2023 such and such a thing will happen, and Q is absolutely right. Now Q is not one individual. I believe Q to be, I think Q is a group, and it's backed up by a very sophisticated computer, very sophisticated. I mean, technology that we're probably not aware of. How else can anybody make these accurate predictions with these Q messages that are coming out? I think Trump was I think he was approached years before and asked to play this role. And I think that what's happening right now is that it's hard to believe that Trump is an outsider, considering the fact that he's been an insider for many decades. But it seems that there's some evidence now, I believe, that Trump may have actually been pulled back to a point where we need somebody with a name that he has and somebody who's going to bring awareness to what is happening now. And I think this will only help Trump. That's what I'm getting at. I think whatever's happening right now will only help in the 2024 election. That's the way I'm seeing it. I'm not against Trump. I think what I appreciate about him is controversial, but you know what? I want the most controversial person you can put in there. I don't want this. I hear this nonsense. I hear people say, "Oh, well, we need somebody who's not going to polarize us." Oh, hell with that! I want polarization because I want people talking, right? And Trump does that. I want people talking. I want you to get it out, and let's talk about it. All right? We don't have to fight with each other because that's really what they want. But we're not doing that. We're going to talk about it. So I think Trump has been good for the narrative, in my opinion. I think it's been good for the narrative. And I think what's happening right now may be planned. I think Trump expected this. I think he saw this coming, and I think he knew this was coming. Remember what he said 2 years ago? When he left office, the very day he left office, he said the best is yet to come.
Yeah. Because it's kind of depressing from our point of view, because it looks like the communists are basically taking over.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's a lot of communist infiltration. That goes back actually to right back to the Kennedy assassination. There's a connection to the Kennedy assassination and what is happening now, I mean, you go back even further. I mean, you have to go back even further than Kennedy assassination and go back to 1913 with the Federal Reserve Bank. That is a tool by the communist is one level, but there's even a force higher than a communist. And and what they have done in the last 50, 60 years, and that in part is what the Kennedy assassination was all about, to so disrupt society, to affect the American psyche on a very basic level, that make them vulnerable to infiltration. And since that point, a lot of American institutions here in Canada as well. I mean, Trudeau, the son of, Fidel Castro, right? We've had infiltration, communist infiltration, starting virtually the day after Kennedy was assassinated. They've invaded Hollywood. They've infiltrated Hollywood, academia, politics. But that's becoming exposed now. And I'm a year ago, if you had asked me this, I was worried. I was worried that we may actually lose. But I'm a little more encouraged now because there is a lot of
there's a huge backlash against woke in the UK. I'm noticing, and you'll find it in the comment sections. So if you have something crazy woke that's on social media, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or something, the key is not to look at the article, look at the comments. This will give you the mindset, and it is just being obliterated, which is great.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's one other thing I like to add to that. When it comes to Trudeau over here in Canada, I find very interesting, and I like to also gauge things from a local point of view and see where it's going, because locally usually says a lot too. Like, what are your next door neighbors thinking? What are your friends thinking? What is the person in the restaurant thinking? Mm-hmm. And most of my friends are liberals. All right. My wife and I, it's interesting, we're sort of the odd people out, but most of them are liberals. But what's happening with them, and most of them were liberal, well, of course, Trudeau supporters, but 9 out of the 10 people we have talked to in terms of being liberal supporters no longer support Trudeau.
Oh, yeah. He's got one of the lowest approval ratings on earth for a leader, 25% apparently.
Exactly. I think he is now officially the most hated prime minister this country's ever had.
He's one of the worst people on this planet. This is a man behind murdering people's dogs who are protesting against the jibby jab, the ouchie fouchie. He actually wanted his own police force to go up to people, the truckers honking their horns, take their dogs away and murder them. That's what this man was doing.
I mean, they were putting up bouncy castles, on the streets, and they were called terrorists, right? These truckers, for the kids to have a little fun, and they were called terrorists. And it was embarrassing watching the mainstream media because they went through great lengths. They did everything they could to try to discredit, and all they ended up doing was giving the truckers more support in terms of the Canadian public. I mean, the response was absolutely overwhelming. What was very interesting about that is the millions of people that came out and lined the streets when the truckers were converging on Ottawa, and they were lining the streets in support of the truckers. And it is that one moment in our history, that really changed events for the better. It was after that the mandates dropped.
Yeah.
Right? But not before they got a lot of damage done. I mean, when I look at my family and most of my friends, most of them fell for the narrative, and a lot of them are on their 5th shot, and it's pretty freaking scary what's happening to them. I'm seeing the effects of it on them now.
Oh yeah,
and it's really starting to worry me. So anybody wants to come at me and tell me that I'm spewing disinformation, I refer you to my family. I refer you to my friends. I refer you to my next door neighbors. I'm seeing it with them. They've all bought into the narrative, and they're having effects from this medical intervention. I don't want to say it on air here, but you know what I'm getting at. But the good news is that even they themselves are turning on Trudeau.
Yeah, good.
So that's the good thing about
Trudeau admires China. I don't know. You've probably seen that.
Of course he does. Oh yeah.
He thinks China does a tremendous job in controlling its citizens and handling.
He was blunt about that, wasn't he? I mean, it was incredible. It was incredible what he said. I mean, it was just unbelievable that he would actually say that.
I know.
And a democratic country, considering his father was a known Marxist, right? Right? Before he shifted over to liberals because that was his chance to gain power, his dad back in the 60s. I mean, it's incredible. One thing that a lot of people seem to forget is that politicians like Trudeau and the rats that run the World Economic Forum, they have intelligence, right? But overall, they're not smart people.
Yeah.
They really, like they're sitting beside themselves to this day, wondering what the hell went wrong. We thought we had control over the last 3 years.
I think maybe they believe their own bullshit.
Yeah.
I think
that's what narcissists do, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they groom themselves in the mirror in the morning. Well, that's not working for Klaus Schwab very well, is it?
I've just got this image of Trudeau. Wherever he goes, he's got like a little personal hand mirror, and he's got his comb, and he's just doing this.
Yeah.
Just treating himself like a peacock everywhere he goes.
Well, it's just a funny story about that. I was in New York last month for my wife and I. We drove down. We got some family there. We came back, and I was talking to somebody who's up the road here from me, and she says, "Oh, I guess you missed all the excitement." I'm in a Liberal riding, okay? So this Liberal riding is part of Trudeau's cabinet. The politician here is in his cabinet. So there was a huge protest right down the street here, and I moved out of Toronto 2 years ago. During the height of the COVID scare, the COVID propaganda. I mean, I moved out of Toronto because it was unbearable to be there. Everybody was their neurosis was too much to deal with, right? So we got out of there. Anyway, she was telling me there was a huge protest right down my street here against Trudeau, and this is a Liberal riding. So that tells you everything you need to know. Everywhere he goes, he's heckled.
Yeah.
Mainstream media doesn't tell you that, but we see it.
It's interesting how the mighty fall, because the communist leader of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, she just suddenly resigned immediately.
Is she a dame now or something?
Oh, she's been made a dame now.
Yeah, she's a dame.
And there's something she made about some journalist asked her about mandates and making things compulsory, and she said, yes, I will make it mandatory, like a crazed communist leader. But also,
somebody likes to it. Sorry, go ahead.
So we've got a Scottish leader called Nicola Sturgeon, who's again one of these woke, crazy, communist type people, shutting down freedom of speech. She hates freedom of speech, and so she suddenly, this is funny, she resigned quickly for no reason. We just thought, oh, that's a bit odd. Recently, she's now been arrested for fraud, and she's had her garden home digged up twice. Digging up her garden, her back garden, looking for evidence. God knows what they're looking for, but yeah, it's interesting how they're falling one by one.
Well, do you know that the Scottish that was the former, not Prime Minister of Scotland, but the head of Scotland, because I know
First Minister.
Yeah, First Minister. That made the mainstream media over here that she was arrested.
Wow.
Yeah. I was pleasantly surprised. It went with my morning coffee. I was enjoying every moment of it.
Just Trudeau, miniature, shrunk, Scottish, and female, and you'll get an idea of what she's about.
Well, isn't it interesting? They're all falling like dominoes, and this was predicted by Q like a couple of years ago. They'll all fall like dominoes. It's exactly what we're seeing. Yeah. I'm a little concerned about Australia, though. They seem to still have a foothold there, right? Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of worry about that, but they're falling like dominoes. They don't have the grip here in Canada that they did. Now, having said that, Canadians tend to be, I was watching on your show, your video. I'm not sure if it was with Beata or someone else. I know somebody was talking about nice people. Canadians are nice people, but I think actually, Andy, you were talking about that.
Andy said that, yeah.
Yeah, Andy said that. That's right.
Naive.
But naive and a little too passive for my liking. And I think that's going to change, because I do believe now there's a lot of rumblings within all levels here of government and the media on the medical intervention. I think that's going to break through, because there's a lot of backlash starting to build here. I think Canadians have their limit, and I think that may be their limit. So I'm hoping if we ever talk again, we can get into some other matters like the WHO treaty, which is very scary too. People should be
that.
Yeah.
The WHO treaty, for anyone listening who doesn't know what that is, if you think mask mandates and ouchie Fauci mandates and COVID mandates were crazy and draconian and barbaric upon the people, well, guess what? Our world governments are about to sign up with WHO, who will have the final say should another pandemic come our way. So if another pandemic comes along, every country is going to basically do what WHO says. And who controls who? Mostly China and Bill Gates.
Yeah.
And Roger Daltrey.
Yeah.
Have you heard this one? Have you heard this one? So they've actually said, some news channel, that they want to cut food production. In order to help climate change, the US needs to cut down on the amount of food that it produces. Well, guess who owns, apparently, the majority of agricultural land in the United States? Bill Gates. Now, isn't that a coincidence?
Yeah.
So their next tactic, I think, is to starve people for climate change. Help the planet by starving yourself.
Well, that's exactly what happened during the Bolshevik Revolution, when they assassinated the Tsar and killed his family. I mean, that's exactly what happened there. What they did was they cut off supply lines, and they starved like 15, 20 million people to death. And that's what they're trying to now. They can't do it blatantly like they did back then, but there are signs that it is happening here. But there are also signs that a lot of people are now starting to become aware of it.
Yeah.
We're starting to look at local remedies, like connecting with a local farmer and working out some kind of business arrangement. I'm in a condo. I can't grow my own food in the balcony, right? But what we can do is connect with a farmer and maybe work out some kind of business arrangement where we can pick up, some fruits and vegetables on a monthly basis type of thing. So there are ways around that. And I find what's going to happen is people are going to stay away from the large box stores per se, the corporate-owned stores, and start going local. And I'm starting to see that too. So there seems to be a counteroffensive. But you're absolutely right. How is it that dozens of food processing plants just somehow blew up the last year? I mean, just miraculously just blew up. I mean, it just happened, right? A dairy factory blew up, right? I expect that from an oil refinery, but not a dairy factory.
So methane.
Either dozens or hundreds of them, just again and again and again. I've got somebody who shows me links. It's just incredible. They just go boom all over.
Yeah. I mean, it's. But I think, and I'm not sure yet, but there seems to be some counter push now the other way. So I think people are starting to become aware of that. I mean, we had just Senator John Kerry. You're both familiar with Senator Kerry, former presidential candidate. He was blatant about it. Just the other day, he wants farmers to stop growing food to fight climate change. Are you freaking kidding me?
I think that's the article I saw. And sitting next to him was Bill Gates.
Yeah. Smiling. Now put the cameras. Take a photo of yourself with Jeffrey Epstein. Let's see how that works out, right?
How many visits? Was it 16 visits on Lolita Express to the pedo?
Oh yeah. Clinton flew first class, didn't he?
Yeah.
If I love this,
sorry, go ahead.
Go on. I was just going to suggest something. I mean, we've got to come to a close soon, but I've been thinking about, you talk about assassinations, and we've been talking about Kennedy being assassinated. And I know you're going to be writing a book about it, and you do talk about it in your second book. You go into quite a lot of detail there, and there's obviously that historical footage where you got Kennedy. I think it might have been in a stadium. I think he said this speech kind of twice, so I'm not quite sure which one I'm referring to. But he says, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, because it's hard." And there's all these people around him. And in the background, I think it's Lyndon B. Johnson. And Kennedy's saying this speech, "We choose to go to the moon." And obviously, Johnson was the guy that succeeded Kennedy after the assassination. But it's at the point, I studied like the facial expressions of Lyndon B. Johnson whilst Kennedy was saying that speech. And he says, "We will go to the moon, blah, 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 blah." And you can see Lyndon B. Johnson sort of frown or smirk or do some weird expression as if like saying, "Oh, that's a load of crap," or something like that. It's really, really worth just checking it out, because most people are focused on Kennedy saying that famous speech. And I thought, I'm just going to check the other people out there and see what they're doing, and how they're reacting. And he was a guy that was probably in the know about the assassination. And once he got control and things like that, the thing changed. But it's kind of like that he knew that they weren't going to get to the moon from just looking at his expressions. I'd just suggest to people, go and check that speech out and see what you think, if you're good at language.
I agree with you. And there's one more interesting point about Lyndon Johnson. There's a video, it's on YouTube. He came out, he gave an interview to Walter Cronkite. This is after he left office in 1968, so this was 1969. And Walter Cronkite asked him about for those of you who don't know, was a CBS anchor. Walter Cronkite asked Johnson about the assassination and the Warren Commission report. And Johnson came back and said, I think that there were international connections. And then Cronkite came back and said, well, is that a repudiation of the Warren Commission? He said, no. He said they were honorable men, they did a thorough job. But I think what he was alluding to was the international connections, not so much with, Cuba or the Soviet Union or anything like that, even higher up than the World Economic Forum, even though the World Economic Forum at that point didn't technically exist until 2 years later, but it existed in another form. So this is how deep the Kennedy assassination goes. So I have no qualms about what you're saying about Johnson. He was almost mocking Kennedy. He knew what was coming and what wasn't coming, right? And it's interesting, he left office just before the official moon landing.
Yeah.
There's a similar video. I don't know if you guys have seen this, and this is fascinating. Of a public announcement, a public speech by President Reagan, mid-80s, and he's got this, I've forgotten who it is, but this guy looming over him and kind of like telling him off and telling him not to say that or do say that. So Reagan is kind of like, there's this and that, and this guy's going, and you don't hear what this guy is saying, but you can kind of lip read, and he's really having a go. And at that moment, you just think, Reagan's not running the show. No. Reagan's not president here. Whoever the fuck this guy is, guy is calling the shots, because this guy was telling Reagan off, and Reagan looked embarrassed like a little naughty schoolboy and then corrected himself. And I thought that was so telling about what the presidential situation is in America.
I have some small admiration for Reagan, because he was compromised physically and then emotionally and mentally 3 or 4 months into his presidency with the attempted assassination. And we know now, I mean, there's lots of evidence out there that points in the direction of his vice president at that time as being behind, or at least being in the know as to why he was supposed to be killed. That didn't happen. But they did accomplish the fact that he basically became a lame duck president. He was very easy to control at that point, because let's face it, he was in his 70s and he's severely wounded. I mean, he almost died, but he came back. But he was, I don't think he had the fight in him after that. And who can blame the man? You know, it was absolutely amazing that he recovered from his wounds at that age.
When are the next Canadian elections? When can you get rid of Trudeau?
So technically, Trudeau can be in for another 2 or 3 years, but there seems to be building memento. He's right now supported by a socialist party, the NDP.
Where's the surprise?
Because he has a minority government. He doesn't have a majority. And there's now talk up here of election interference as well. And very much like what's going on in the States. I don't trust these electronic voting machines.
No.
And you can't even talk about it. And if you can't even talk about it, they're hiding something. That's always been sort of where I'm at with this. So there is some things happening here in this country. For example, in the province of Alberta, which I'm not sure if Beata is from Alberta, if I'm not mistaken. She might be. Anyway, they just voted in a far-right conservative. First thing, she came out and said that one of the things that she found horrific in the last 3 years, it was discrimination against the unvaccinated. And for a politician to say that tells you that, hey, there might be some hope for that province. I mean, they're kind of like, I liken them to Texas, you know? Yeah, that kind of thing, right? And so they basically thrown out the socialists in that province. And we're seeing them move now towards far-right ideology. Now, I'm not saying that one ideology is better than the other, but if you have to choose between an ideology, go right, don't go left.
Yeah.
right? That's kind of, and then form your own opinion and keep your eye on them as well, the ones you went with, right? Because people really have to start thinking of themselves. Politicians are not going to do it for you. They're not there for you and me. They never have been. They never will be. So we have to keep them in check.
Right.
Wasn't it Trump who said he was asked about Area 51? What did you find there? And he didn't say anything other than, I just found it very interesting.
Yeah. Is it? Yeah. Code.
Yeah.
And that's another thing too. When people say, "Oh, that's not true," well, they denied Area 51 for what? For decades, until the CIA finally came out a few years ago and admitted it existed when we could all see it anyway. But that didn't matter, right?
I think we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. But I mean, there's lots I could go on about. So I think we'll have to have Randy back again for a follow-up, because I'd still like to go into the JPL occult connection in the future, which was in your last book, where we talked about the guy who was the founder of one of the founders of JPL, or you talked about him in your book, and we could go more into the Kennedy assassination as well, and see where that takes us as well. So I'd like to invite you back at some future point if you're up for that, Randy.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to come back and chat some more.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out and joining Andy and I on a very, very interesting discussion. You start off on one area, but you wind and you go all through these little rabbit holes. It's very interesting because it never comes out the way you predict, but that's the fun of it, isn't it? So thank you very much. And people can find your book on Amazon, can't they, if they're intrigued to know more?
Yep, they can find it on Amazon, and you can go to find me on YouTube, and I talk a lot about it there, and I put the links there, so easy to find.
Okay, so the title of your book, for those that want to know more, is?
So the title is The Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, Part 1.
Yeah.
And this is Part 2.
Part 2. Same kind of title, but Part 2. And it's very interesting because you go into the technical side of the engines, and you go into JPL, which is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the second book. You also talk about the Kennedy assassination as well. So, very, very interesting. It's very different from what I would call a typical moon hoax book. It comes in at a very different angle, which I think is great. So thank you very much once again, Randy Walsh, joining us from Canada. And
it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure being here.
Yeah,
thank you.
Randy.
Thanks, Andy, for coming on once more to join us on the Paranormal Peep Show. And thank you to our audience for listening. And we'll catch you next month. Look out for us on YouTube, on Rumble, on all the Spreakers and other platforms, downloadable podcast stations. Anything you can find us on, we'll probably be there somewhere lurking. So check it out now from the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. We'll catch you next month. Goodbye.
And the final thing would be, if Mike Barra is listening, or anyone knows of Mike Barra, if he would like to come on the show, he's quite welcome to, because he claims he's written a book and repudiated everything that we're talking about. Put your money where your mouth is, and come join us.
Come and join us, Mike, if you're listening. Hear from you.
Cheers.
All right. Take care, all. Thanks. Good night. All right.